Okay, can you hear me? Yeah, all right. Love it when technology works. All right, we're good. So, good afternoon. I'm going to start out with saying that all the slides and the background information is available at that URL and that QR code, and I'll present them again later, so you don't have to worry about that now. But you may wonder about this title. The Cathedral and the Bazaar was a blog post by Eric Raymond, in which he describes two forms of software development. The Cathedral, top-down, and Bazaar, which is more broad-based. And we'll get to them in a bit. But what I'm introducing today is this idea of the Coffeehouse as a development concept. And along the way, I'll present some risks that are associated with open source development and present a possible solution for mitigating some of those risks. But first, let me introduce myself and present a little history, I hope. Come on, pay attention. Here we go. I'm Claude Warren. I'm a member of the Apache Software Foundation. I work on a number of Apache projects and some other things as well. I consider myself an effectuator. My social media links are there. I am not the Claude Warren on Wikipedia. That is my father. And if you look him up, you will also find my mother. He was an anthropologist and she was an historian. And that's a really good segue because I want to start talking about the year 1688. And in 1688, Edward Lloyd founded a coffee house on Tower Street in London. And his customers were in the shipping trade, so they talked a lot about shipping. They would talk about ship schedules and manifests and what was lost at sea and things like that. So you have to remember now that shipping is the high-tech industry of the time. And as with any high-tech industry, there's a fortune to be made and a fortune to be lost. So there were several major risks that his customers had to deal with. And the major risks to shipping in the late 17th century, sinking, right? And according to Wikipedia, excluding ships lost in battle, 318 ships were wrecked in the 17th century. And more were lost without a trace. Those are the ones we know about. Pirates, second source of risk. The 17th and early 18th century, golden age of piracy. You also might lose your cargo overboard in a storm. So again, going to Wikipedia, 87 storms in the 17th century in the Atlantic. This is definitely an undercount because it's only going to talk about the Atlantic, and it's only storms that Europeans knew about. So any storm that the word didn't get back about isn't going to be counted. Right? And finally, the prices could crash before your product arrived. And now the tulip crash of 1637 is earlier than we're talking about here, but it's a good example that if you loaded a ship full of tulips in 1637 and shipped them off, by the time they got to port, the price would be worthless. So the people at Lloyd's Coffee House would sit around and talk about these issues, and they came up with a strategy. And a risk reduction strategy. And their risk reduction strategy was to invest in multiple ships and cargo. So rather than putting all of your eggs in one basket, you would split the money across multiple ships and multiple cargo. And then if there was a profit, you'd share in the profit. And if there was a loss, you'd share in the loss. This effectively made Lloyd's one of the earliest insurance syndicates and evolves to the Lloyd's of London that we know today. Okay, so with the benefit of hindsight and the knowledge that those who do not understand the past are doomed to repeat it, let's look at the risk exposure to open source software. First, a little more history. When I first gave this talk, it was at ApacheCon in 2022. It was 5 minutes, no slides, and when I got to this point in the talk, I recited a whole bunch of dates and events in the history of open source software development, and I find that really boring. So instead, I'm going to give you the 3 salient facts. Synopsys did a code survey in 2019. Okay, it was a little while ago now, but still. 99% of the code bases that they audited contained open source software. 82% contained outdated or abandoned open source components. And I want to point out that this XKCD panel is so on point that project in Nebraska and maintained by some random person in Nebraska have become idioms, meaning any open source project that's maintained by a single person. I've seen that in a lot of presentations, I'll tell you. Okay. And finally, 73% had at least one license issue. And this arises because free and open source software licenses are not necessarily compatible with each other. So this can make it illegal to mix or link components that have different licenses. For example, if you had code that was licensed under the Mozilla Public License 1.1, and you wanted to mix that with code that was under the GNU General Public License, you couldn't distribute that without violating one of those two licenses. All right? So even though both of those are approved by the Open Source Initiative and the Free Software Foundation. Okay, so, to give you an idea, this graph, with all of its fuzziness, shows several popular licenses, and the arrows indicate which ones are can be included in others or linked to from others. Now, I am not a legal professional, a lawyer, solicitor, any of those things, so seek proper guidance before you use this graph, and your mileage may vary. So, why do we care? Well, we care first off because your project probably contains open source products, right? And we care because that outdated or abandoned components are not going to be upgraded when vulnerabilities are discovered. Now, the XLab GitHub 2020 Insight Report listed about 54 million projects. And they also showed about 14 million active developers, so that means that there are roughly 4 projects per developer. And the question is, how many of those are one developer projects in Nebraska? Okay, and then we want to know why. Why would they become abandoned? And I think there are really 2 major reasons. One is a life change. Marriage, children, sick parents, new job, financial stress, all of these things vying for time that was previously dedicated to open source development. And the other is disillusionment with the process. And I can think of 2 examples of that. One is, I will probably mispronounce his name, Azir Kuchulu, who deleted the left pad NPM module in 2015. And he broke thousands of websites when that happened. Right? And he felt that he was being mistreated by NPM, and in fact, he stated, "The situation made me realize that NPM is somebody's private land where corporate is more powerful than people." Right? And the second one I can think of is Marek Squires, who sabotaged the Faker and Colors NPM modules, again, destroying thousands, or damaging thousands of websites, and that was in 2022. And he basically said, "I'm tired of supporting major companies for free." All right. So, which brings us to this, almost half of respondents to this, to the TideLift 2021 survey said that the lack of funds, lack of financial compensation was the top reason for that they disliked being a maintainer. All right. So, second issue, licensing issues. They're expensive to mitigate. And there have been a number of projects recently that have changed licenses from pure open source to something that's partially closed or something like that. So you have 2018 MongoDB, 2021 Elasticsearch and Kibana, 2022 Akka, all changed their licenses. And so projects that were dependent on that have to either change the projects that they're dependent on, purchase licenses, or have their customers purchase the license. Now, most of these changes were done for financial reasons. That the companies doing this felt that they needed to be able to make more income from the development that they were doing. Okay. Now, that last one there, transitive dependencies, make any upstream issue your issue. And that one should scare you. All right? So if we look at this graph, nice project dependencies, and you run project P way up there at the top, and project O becomes abandoned, it's right there next to it, just right below it. You can probably pick up the code, you can create a new module that basically does the same thing, or perhaps you can find a near drop-in replacement or pick up the maintenance on the project yourself. And if project O changes the license, you also have many of the same problems. So this isn't too bad. Whoa, too far. Go back one. There we go. Is that right? Yeah. But if DD, way down here at the bottom, is no longer supported, becomes abandoned, then you have to know that O depends on H, depends on T, depends on DD to understand that you have a problem. And depending on how DD is written, the language it's written in, if it disappears, your entire application could grind to a halt. If it's no longer supported and there's a security hole discovered, how do you know whether or not you're impacted? Right? And if your project is II up there at the top, the supply chain or the dependency chain is even longer and more convoluted. So how do you track all of the dependencies and manage the dependencies across your project? This is one of those things, this is one of the risks you're going to have to worry about. Okay, so yeah. So what was that Cathedral versus the Bazaar thing? All right, as I said, Eric Raymond talked about Cathedral and the Bazaar. Cathedral is top-down. Usually you have some kind of project plan and you've got control over what's going in. It's very much like a closed source project in a lot of ways. And there's this impression that if it is too tightly controlled, that they're not really open to contributions. Okay? So for software in not all of them, but software in that sort of subcategory, you have to worry about whether or not changes that you need or fixes that you need can get put into the project stream and be merged in and accepted. Now I want to be clear, not all Cathedral development projects are so tightly controlled that they don't accept external contributions, but it's a risk and the project needs to be evaluated or assessed for their openness. In the Bazaar, it's more bottom-up. You have more developers, a wider pool of developers, tends to lack the tightly controlled specific design goals that you see in the Cathedral. And some argue that the lack of these controls then leads to difficult to detect errors. One example would be in encryption libraries, where if somebody wants to optimize the code path, they might put in a different random number generator, a weaker random number generator. It'll be faster, but not as secure. Now, I want to be clear again, I'm not claiming that this is always a risk, but it's one that should be assessed for each project. And then finally, there are combinations. So you have projects that sort of take a little of this and a little of that, and again, they also need to be assessed for whether or not they will fit in the development process or whether they're fit for purpose for what they're developing. And all of them have their place. They all can develop beautiful code, and I'm not arguing against any one of them, just that we need to be aware of what the development process is for each of the modules and understand how that impacts what they're developing and whether or not it's fit for purpose for what we're trying to use it for. Okay. So are you overwhelmed yet? You have to find the upstream dependencies, you've got to analyze the issues, you have to look at license conflicts, you've got to see if it's the wrong development strategy for the module, you have to analyze the risks, is the developer community going to crash, is there a license change possible? You have to analyze your mitigation factors, paths, can you contribute to the upstream project? Do you have the ability to fork the project if necessary? What are the unknown unknowns? And what are the things you know that ain't so? All right, so what are we going to do? Let's have a cup of coffee. All right, it'll enhance our energy levels, we'll be less likely to suffer a heart attack, and not as likely to suffer a stroke. And I want to point out that I got this off of the internet, and is that great American President Abraham Lincoln said, "Don't trust everything you read on the internet." We could open a coffee house. You can meet like-minded people, and people with different opinions, and we could discuss high-tech topics. Edward Lloyd did it, and it brought the shipping industry its first insurance company. All right, so think about that for a minute. But let's look at what organizations might be able to do to mitigate their risks. First thing is, change the organizational perception of open source software and stop thinking of open source as a cost avoidance strategy. All right? And the second is to start supporting open source development as an insurance policy. All right? So every euro that a company puts into open source development is a euro they're not going to have to spend when the project in Nebraska collapses. And every euro they invest in an open source project will buy goodwill from that ecosystem. Create an OSPO, create an open source program office. This is an office within your organization that looks at the open source projects that your product is dependent upon. Right? And then you use that OSPO. And you want to use that OSPO as a firewall between your secret sauce and the open source community. All right? So you want to hire developers who work for the OSPO on the open source projects. And then you don't show them the internal code, because this will keep the valuable IP from leaking. What they don't know, they can't leak. All right? They can also provide technical support for your internal developers. So you have a problem, when your internal developers have a problem, they can come to the OSPO, they can ask the question, how do we fix this? The guy in the OSPO is either going to know, he's going to know who will know, or he'll at least know where to go to ask the question. All right? So you can build your own support. You can use the OSPO to analyze the upstream projects so that you can tell if there's look at the community viability. So other than the bus factor or the lottery factor, if you prefer, there are other metrics you can measure community viability. The Community Health Analytics and Open Source Software Group, that's the beautiful acronym CHAOS, publishes metrics for various dimensions. The Apache Kibble project calculates and displays metrics on a dashboard, numerous metrics on a dashboard. Your OSPO can determine which metrics to use and apply them to the upstream communities to meet what your project needs. All right? You can use the OSPO to analyze the upstream project for its openness to contribution. So how difficult is it to contribute to the upstream project? Is it difficult enough that maybe you should consider replacement of the project with something else if it's available? You can look at existing license issues. So look at the internal projects, your internal organization's licenses. Do you have a license issue? Your OSPO can work on figuring that out. And they can also look at the upstream projects and determine if there are licensing issues upstream, or if there's just licensing issues because you're combining things that shouldn't be combined. You can determine if the process is upstream or fit for purpose. Are we developing the security app in a way that makes it easy to insert malicious code? Okay, so there are a number of things we can do here. So you can also use the OSPO to support those upstream projects. And you can do this by hiring developers to work on those projects. You can hire developers that already work on the project, or developers who are interested in working on that project, or working on other projects within the foundation that hosts the project, or just are interested in open source. But if you hire developers, you can put them to work on the project, and you can try to make sure that there is a viable, active community there supporting that project. And I should note that while I say developer here, I want to include documentation specialists, community specialists, communication specialists, testers, anything that the upstream project needs. You can donate money or resources to projects. So, it's possible to donate money to support some developers. It's possible to donate money to support the project infrastructure, or perhaps donate time on your organization's systems for builds or storage of built products for those open source projects. And finally, support the existing foundations. there are a number of foundations. The Free Software Foundation, the Linux Foundation, Apache Foundation, to name 3, that all support development. Oh man, I am stuck here. Okay. All right, sorry about that. Anyway. So there are a number of ways to support open source development. But check with your legal counsel to ensure that you're not going to run afoul of local ordinances. All right, so we looked at what the organizational solution is, but what's the community solution? We're all here together as a community. What's the community solution among all of our organizations? In that case, it is the Coffeehouse. In the Coffeehouse, in this case, we want OSBOs and other interested parties to come together and share data about their open source projects. So if you think back to that dependency diagram, there are a number of applications that are going to have same or similar dependencies. They'll have the same dependencies on the same project. So if your OSBO can work with another OSBO that has a shared dependency or multiple shared dependencies, you can split the process and each of you take half, right? Now you've just cut your workload in half. If you can work with multiple OSBOs, you can reduce the amount of work you have to do to figure out where the problems are, where the issues are. Now, there is a concept called inner source development, and this is often thought of as open source development within a firewall. So if you're working on something that maybe is too close to the secret sauce, you can get together with some other organizations who are working on the same things that are maybe too close to their secret sauce, and you can share the data within that group as an inner source development. And that way you can trust each other, and you can begin to trust each other, and you can begin to trust that they are doing the same level of research that you need to have done to validate the projects. All right. You can select the metrics together. So there's a whole lot of metrics out there. And they're going to measure different things, and your project, your organization may have a different need, a different metric that they want to use, or maybe there's a reason that they think you shouldn't use a specific measurement, but you can get together and have these discussions, and you can select the most appropriate metrics to measure what it is you're trying to achieve. And finally, you can publish reports on common projects. So if inner source projects could come together and report and publish their reports, and these would be things like the Endor Labs State of Dependency Management or the X Labs GitHub 2020 Insight Report are 2 examples of reports like this. All right, so in closing, the Cathedral and the Bazaar are good metaphors for 2 popular styles of open source development. Let's add the Coffeehouse as a metaphor for supporting open source development as insurance against catastrophic failures of upstream projects. Thank you.